The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister isn't worth the chaos after 8 years. His Minister of Immigration admits that housing and services are overwhelmed in Quebec because of the asylum seeker crisis. This followed the decision by the Prime Minister to remove visas for Mexico, which caused the number of asylum seekers to go sky high. So only 11% are accepted as real refugees. Will the Prime Minister cancel his decision and restore order in our system? The Honourable Member of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, as you know, this type of decision has to be taken seriously. We must have completed diplomatic measures with Mexico. No statement will be made in a rush in the House of Commons. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister is not worth the chaos or the crime. Auto theft is a federal crime. His decision to amend the criminal code to free car thieves is federal. The poor management of ports is federal. And cars can be sent to organized crime and terrorists. The RCMP is responsible for organized crime and is also a federal responsibility. Will the Prime Minister reverse his poor management and changes to the federal criminal code to stop the crisis that he has caused? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I know that the Leader of the Opposition likes to invent blame for everyone. Perhaps I can correct his question by saying that we are, of course, working with provincial partners in Ontario, in Quebec, on this very important issue. We've invited for next week ministers responsible from provinces, police, industry, insurance companies. I had an excellent meeting with the Conservative Premier of Ontario, and we will do even more to crack down on this problem.
The Opposition.
Lots of meetings, lots of photo ops, lots of spending, lots of car theft. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the car theft crime, which is up 300% in Toronto and 100% in Montreal. This is a federal problem. It's his mismanagement of federal ports that allows our cars to be stolen and sent abroad. His quick release of criminals on catch and release who steal our cars is a federal matter, and his mismanagement of our federal police force, which is responsible for organized crime. Will he reverse his failures so we can stop the car theft?
The Honourable Minister for Public Security.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition forgets one important thing that this government did in collaboration with the provinces from coast to coast. We strengthened bail conditions to ensure that precisely the circumstance that my honourable friend continues to repeat inaccurately is not the case. And I was very pleased that Premier Ford thanked our government at the event yesterday for working with them constructively to put these auto thieves behind bars and do everything we can to bring an end to this unacceptable practice.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Here are the facts. They brought in catch and release bail. They reversed part of it. But guess where catch and release remains in place even after their most recent bill? Car theft. Whoa. So car thieves can still get catch and release same day bail because of this Prime Minister's amendment to the federal criminal code. Ports are federal, he mismanaged them. The RCMP is federal, he mismanaged that. The criminal code is federal, he brought in catch and release. Won't he own up to his failures, reverse these decisions so we can keep our cars?
The Honourable Minister for Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday when the Minister of Public Safety and I were with the Premier of Ontario, what we announced was $121 million of funding to help with attacking crime in places like Ontario. What that will do will help to stop this flow of what we're seeing in terms of auto theft. The other thing we heard from the Premier and what we've heard from the law enforcement officials who were there is that if you want to tackle this, you got to tackle organized crime. Interestingly, the Leader of the Opposition is directing his caucus to vote against anti-money laundering initiatives that are contained in the Fall Economic Statement that would address exactly that.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has accomplished something that only he could do. Our central bank, which can create cash, is actually losing money. Now, how did this happen? He forced the central bank to create $600 billion of cash to fund his overspending over the last 3 years. To pay for it, the bank makes deposits into the accounts of large financial institutions. Interest rates on those deposits, of course, have gone through the roof, meaning that taxpayers are now forced to bail out those losses. Will he admit that his incompetence now forces Canadians to pay twice, once for the inflation the money printing caused, and twice to bail out the bank, which is failing?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if the Leader of the Opposition is aware, but Canada has the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio and the lowest deficit in the G7. And what we do on this side of the House is maintain prudent fiscal responsibility while investing in Canadians, especially vulnerable Canadians. Let's look at the Canada Child Benefit. Let's look at $10 a day childcare. Let's look at the Canada Dental Benefit, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we actually have compassion for Canada.
I'd like to encourage members to please keep your comments to yourselves until it is your turn to speak. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. The CMHC report confirms that the housing crisis is worse than ever. There have never been so few available housing units in 20 years. Rents have risen by 8%, and finding a new home in Quebec is 17% more expensive. Why? Because the population is growing too fast. Let's be clear. Immigrants are not responsible for the housing crisis. The Liberals are, with their out-of-touch immigration policies. They've gotten us all in trouble, starting with immigrants. Are they finally going to readjust their immigration policies in line with our capacity? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. It's interesting. They don't want to blame immigrants, but they tell us to adjust our plans. I'd like to ask the Bloc members, who are mostly from rural areas, they can go talk to farmers and ask them where they find their workers. Do they want to cut temporary workers? They need to answer the question because it's an important one. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. There's a shortage of 3.5 million housing units, according to CMHC, and at the same time, the Liberals are increasing immigration again in 2024 and 2025. They refuse to share asylum seekers among the provinces to lighten Quebec's load. And the result is a ruined asylum seeker who anonymously confided in the Journal de Montréal, "I'm scared because I'm with my daughter. She's only 9. I don't want to end up on the street." When will the Liberals understand that their irresponsible policies affect real people? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. It's true that these are real people who are affected. We shouldn't treat them like cattle. We need to treat them with respect, humanely. We do encourage asylum seekers to go to different provinces when they ask to, but we need to treat people respectfully, and that is why yesterday I announced over $300 million to house asylum seekers. Canada is receiving people at this time in history. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, there's no break for Quebecers at the grocery store. Now the CEO of Metro has told people, hang on to your hats because starting today it's going to cost even more to eat. And what does the Minister of Industry do? He tells us to look at the flyers. Then he tells us he wants to stabilize prices, which are already too high. Then he wants another study, a typical Liberal nonsense. We all know what the problem is. People are getting ripped off at the checkout. When will this government stand up for people instead of millionaire bosses? The Honourable Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Every day we're going to do our work to make life more affordable for Canadians, including addressing the issue of food prices in this country. Of course, you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, the introduction of the grocery rebate recently, but we're also putting forward new measures to strengthen competition laws in this country and launching recruitment efforts to bring more international grocery chains into Canada, which will create competition in the marketplace, creating better prices for families. We're going to continue to do what we can to help people who are struggling, including implementing reforms that will help address the cost of food in this country.
The honourable member from Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, Manulife just cut a deal with Galen Weston that forces Canadians to fill their prescriptions at Loblaws. This robs patients of their choice of pharmacist and hurts local community pharmacies. Experts say this will restrict Canadians' access to over 250 medications. This is not only anti-competitive, but once again shows Liberals putting corporate greed ahead of people's health, while the Conservatives say nothing. Will this government protect patients and block this corporate collusion as Quebec has done?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we're deeply committed to ensuring that Canadians have access to the drugs that they need for their health and well-being. We have worked hard to make hundreds of millions of dollars in saving, nearly $300 million in saving through bulk purchasing. We're working with provinces and territories through our bilateral agreements to continue to find ways to improve health care across the country and make sure that Canadians have access to the health care they need.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
After 8 years, the Prime Minister is not worth the cost, and the carbon tax is going to drive up food prices again on April 1st when he drives it up by 23%. What's that going to do with food prices? Well, the Keilstra poultry farm in Okotoks says that they're going to go from paying $180,000 this year to $480,000 when the carbon tax is fully quadrupled. These are hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra taxes that all get passed on to the shopper in the grocery aisle, and the rebate doesn't cover any of it. If the Prime Minister won't axe the tax, will he at least cancel his April 1st increase so food prices don't go up even further?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, families in my community do raise the cost of food as a very real concern. That's why we put forward measures like the grocery rebate. That's why we're introducing new reforms that will increase competition. But if the Conservatives would like to help, there's something the opposition leader can do. He can pick up the phone, because as I'm sure he knows, his chief advisor, Jenny Byrne, is actually a registered lobbyist for Loblaws in Ontario. Mr. Speaker, before the Conservatives sling arrows at this side of the House, I would invite the opposition leader to do what we all know is one of his favorite things. Take a look in the mirror.
The honourable member. Order. Order. The honourable member from Regina Capel.
This from a government who literally wrote a check on taxpayers' dollars to give Loblaws millions of dollars for new fridges. I'm going to correct the record there, Mr. Speaker. The minute it's not families that are raising grocery prices in stores, it's this government with their carbon tax. The principle of the carbon tax is to make everyday things in life more expensive and more punishing. But the Prime Minister doesn't care because he never has to deal with those costs. He doesn't have to pay the carbon tax on his flights or put packages of beef back on the shelf. Will he finally have some mercy on Canadian families and axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's hard to accept criticisms with the Conservatives when the person responsible to run their campaign is getting paid on the side to lobby two governments, Loblaws, the giant grocery chain that is actually causing families to pay so much more for groceries than they were previously. On this side of the House, we're going to put measures on the table that are going to help families put food on the table. The Conservatives will align themselves with big grocery chains. We're going to do everything we can to make life more affordable.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member from Foothills.
Today, Conservatives tabled a motion asking the NDP Liberal Carbon Tax Coalition to cancel their plans to increase the carbon tax on April 1st. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, and farmers' carbon tax bills prove that. The numbers are staggering. Prairie Gold Potatoes in southern Alberta is paying $1,500 in carbon taxes every single day. Wow. That's unsustainable, and they have no option but to pass that on to consumers. Will the Prime Minister finally axe his plan to increase the carbon tax on April 1st and make food and farming more affordable?
The Honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The impacts of climate change on our agricultural sector are incredible, which is why we've put in place measures to help our farmers diminish their greenhouse gas emissions. Let's talk about how much farmers in our colleagues, the member from Carleton received $2.4 million, and the member from Carleton in the writing of the member from Dufferin Carleton $3.7 million. In the writing of the member from Haldimand Norfolk, $22 million, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member, before I get to the honourable member of Foothills, I'm going to ask members, please, once again, to please limit your comments to the person who is asking the question or to the person who is responding. Need all of your help to make sure that this happens. The honourable member from Foothills.
Well, the Environment Minister is struggling to find some positive numbers, but I'll tell him the number. When they quadruple the carbon tax, it will cost Canadian farmers $1 billion a year. That does not include the GST, also $1 billion, that the Liberals are charging on top of the carbon tax. Higher carbon taxes, more GST, higher food costs for Canadians. When 2 million Canadians are relying on a food bank every single month, clearly this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. How many Canadians need to rely on a food bank before this Prime Minister cancels his plan to increase the carbon tax on April 1st?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
I would suggest that Conservative members of Parliament should stop misleading Canadians. The carbon price is a thoughtful approach that addresses climate change and affordability. 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back. The Leader of the Opposition's plan to address the climate issue is to take rebates.
He wants to know what thoughtful means.
Colleagues, I'm seeing the body language of some members who are using translation devices who are having great difficulty in hearing the response over the furor. Could I please ask members to allow them to the answer to be made so that all members can understand what is being said. The Honourable Minister from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just say the Conservative Party needs to stop misleading people. The carbon price is an appropriate and thoughtful way to address climate change in a manner that actually addresses affordability. 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back. The Leader of the Conservative Party's plan to address climate change is to take rebates away from Canadian families. It is to let the planet burn. It is to actually ensure that Canada's economic competitiveness will be eroded going forward. He should be ashamed of his thoughtless policy on climate change in the Canadian economy.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. What he should be ashamed of is that after 8 years of this Prime Minister, food banks are overwhelmed. Too many Canadians don't have the means to feed themselves. It will be even worse on April 1st because the Prime Minister will make families even poorer with a new hike on the carbon tax. The Bloc will support this tax hike because the Bloc wants to radically increase the carbon tax. Rather than put in place this Bloc's desire to punish families, will the Prime Minister give Canadians a break rather than a bill on April 1st? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Contrary to the Conservatives, we are there to support the agricultural sector with the energy transition to help them produce the food Canadians need and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. In the writing of the member for Louis Saint Laurent, over $5 million were sent to farmers to help them reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. in Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier, $1.2 million, and we've spent $1.5 billion on farmers throughout the country. What would the Conservative government do? They voted against all of the support for the agriculture sector. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. We will always vote against taxes that increase the price of food, that mean that Canadians can't afford to feed themselves. 2 million Canadians are going to food banks now. Yes, Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, we will be voting against measures like that. The Prime Minister, during his one-week trip to Jamaica, his $89,000 trip, surely didn't go to a food bank. If he'd gone, he would have seen how many Canadians can't afford to feed themselves. Will the Prime Minister cut taxes to allow families to not have to cut their food? The Honourable Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite says he'll vote against. Let me tell you what he voted against. They voted against the Fund for Sustainable Agriculture. Last month, they voted against the fund for the dairy sector. They've voted against helping poultry producers, egg producers, and supply management. What does he vote for? He doesn't vote for farmers. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Quebecers paid $470 million for asylum seekers. Instead of reimbursing them, the minister has announced $100 million for temporary accommodations for future asylum seekers. That's great if it costs less in the future, but he hasn't reimbursed the costs incurred since 2021. It's as if the minister hadn't paid his rent for 2 years. And he comes to us today with part of his rent for February and says we're even. A roommate like that would be thrown out pretty quickly, Mr. Speaker. When will he pay Quebecers back? The Honourable Minister of Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We hear them laugh, but yesterday in the House, the leader of the Bloc Québécois compared immigrants to heat pumps. And then, during my announcement to house asylum seekers, an announcement of over $300 million, he talked about social housing. We need to be serious here. We're not negotiating with the federal member for Belleuil-Chambly, the leader of the Bloc Québécois. We are negotiating with a serious government, the government of Quebec. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. If he can't answer questions in the House of Commons, he doesn't have to come. There's nothing here to reimburse Quebecers for taking in asylum seekers for 2 years. Nothing to help with education, nothing for French language training, for health, nothing for last resort assistance, nothing to share reception with the provinces, nothing to reestablish visas with Mexico, nothing to support our community organizations that are overwhelmed, nothing to speed up the processing of applicants' files, nothing to speed up the granting of work permits, which is supposed to be his job. So concretely, what does this mean for Quebec? The Honourable Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. As you've heard yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we are providing money. Quebec has done more than its share, and we thank them for it. There's also work to be done to accelerate the granting of work permits. That's what we are doing. We are working with Quebec to accelerate this process so that asylum seekers can work in healthcare. It's very important, but it begins with cooperative work with the Government of Quebec. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Now, Quebec receives 45% of Canada's asylum seekers, and it receives just under 28% of new investments in temporary housing. Quebec continues to do far more than its fair share, and it continues to receive far less than its financial share. It's just one more injustice after another. Frankly, at this point, does the minister realize that it's very difficult as Quebecers not to have the impression that we are being laughed at? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois isn't doing anything. Aside from asking questions in the House, it's not doing anything. The minister is working, is collaborating, is talking with Quebec. We've spent $50 million. That's a lot of money. And 70 million, then 100 million. These are huge amounts of money. The Bloc should not mock these financial efforts. We thank Quebec for its work. The Government of Quebec is also working hard, and we will continue to work together despite what the Bloc wants. It just wants disputes. Instead of disputes, we are working together. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are struggling. 2 million of them have to go to food banks to feed their families. Meanwhile, the out-of-touch Prime Minister wants to raise the carbon tax even higher on April 1st. Together with their partners, the Bloc Québécois, they continue to make things worse for Canadians with their so-called environmental plan, which in reality is just a tax plan. Will the Prime Minister show some common sense for once and cancel the tax increase on April 1st? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, what the Conservative Party doesn't seem to understand is that farmers are among those hit hardest by climate change. Look at what's happening with the drought in the prairies. In Alberta, over the summer, drinking water might have to be rationed for people and for farmers. What are the Conservatives saying? They're saying there's no problem with climate change. The planet can burn. Our plan is working. We have reduced greenhouse gases, 30 billion tons, and that's not thanks to the Conservatives. We will continue to be there to fight climate change and work with farmers. Then I have the Honourable Member for Beauce. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More proof of how out of touch this government is. The Minister of the Environment. Canadians are suffering across the country. In Quebec, the carbon tax has a direct and indirect impact on food prices, regardless of the arguments used by the Liberals and the Bloc. The second carbon tax also adds 17 cents a litre, which directly affects the people of Beauce. Unlike the Bloc, I understand that what's good for Canadians is also good for Quebecers. We need to reduce the cost of producing and transporting food so that Canadians can feed themselves properly. So I ask again, I hope they'll understand this time, will the Prime Minister cancel the tax increase on April 1st? The Honourable Minister of Transport. If he wants to talk about being out of touch, I think he's the most out of touch. He knows very well that the tax doesn't apply in Quebec, the price on pollution. He should know that. But what I want to know is, does he understand the impact of climate change on our farmers? Where was he when there were floods? Where was he when there were forest fires? Where was he when people had to move? He was asleep at the switch.
The Honourable Member from Renfrew-Nipissing, Pembroke.
And Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of these NDP Liberals, my constituents are hurting. Edmund from Whitewater is a senior who lives on $20,000 a year. Since November, he's paid $200 in carbon tax on home heating alone. His quarterly climate bribe was $118. Yet this Prime Minister says that Canadians are somehow getting ahead. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will the Liberals stop the April 1st carbon tax hike so groceries, gas, and home heating don't get more expensive for Edmund?
Yeah.
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, once again, folks are entitled to their opinions, but not to their own facts. 80% of Canadian families get more money back, and it actually works in reverse order to income, so that the poorest people in this country, the most...
Once again, colleagues, I'm going to ask you if you could please keep your voices down so that all members, especially francophones who are trying to listen to this through translation, have an opportunity to do so. The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources from the top.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member knows very well that 80% of Canadian families get more money back, and in fact, it's the most vulnerable that are actually much better off. The Conservative Party would take away the rebate. The Conservative leader in his climate plan is to let the planet burn. In fact, when the member for Calgary Forest Lawn was recently asked on television what is the Conservative Party's climate plan, he said the Conservative plan was to build more pipelines and produce more oil. And they're upset when people call them climate deniers. My goodness.
The Honourable Member from... Colleagues. The Honourable Member from Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Rent is due today, and for workers in Port Moody, Coquitlam, that rent will cost over 50% of their monthly paycheck. And for the seniors facing rent eviction due to corporate investors buying up their affordable homes, they are facing homelessness. These out-of-touch Liberals created this mess alongside the cut and gut Conservatives who work for greedy corporations. Why are the Liberals dragging their feet when Canadians desperately need affordable rental homes now?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague sincerely for her advocacy for vulnerable people who are struggling with the cost of finding a place to live. The fact that people are in dire need of housing is why we have significantly increased the pace of introducing policies to build more homes in this country. We have removed taxes from new apartment construction so more apartments will be built. We have committed an additional $1 billion through the Affordable Housing Fund to get more affordable homes built for low-income families. And we put federal money on the table to incentivize cities to change their ways, to increase their ambition, and speed up the process of home building. We're going to continue to do what it takes to end the national housing crisis.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton, Griesbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'll thank the Minister for that response, but it's just not good enough because today rent is due and a new report just came out telling Edmontonians what we already know. Rent is going up and the number of available affordable homes is going down. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister turns a blind eye while Danielle Smith sells off affordable housing just to make her rich CEO friends happy. When will this government stop catering to rich CEOs and put forward a plan to build non-market and co-op housing so that working people can afford a home?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his advocacy as well, and we are committed to building more homes, including affordable housing for low-income families. In fact, in his own community recently, a Métis-led project is going ahead that will provide affordable homes for community residents and support for women and children fleeing violence. We have increased funding for cooperative housing for the first time in decades, with a program to be launched soon, backed by $1.5 billion. We have increased funding for affordable housing in the recent Fall Economic Statement with an additional $1 billion. We have constructed or renovated hundreds of thousands of affordable housing units because we care about the most vulnerable and know that they deserve to have a roof over their head.
The Honourable Member from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, supporting the growth and future of Indigenous communities is critical in advancing reconciliation, and this includes land. Last weekend, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations was in Nanaimo for the signing of a historic land reconciliation agreement. Can the Minister elaborate on how this historic agreement with the Snuneymuxw First Nation aligns with Canada's broader commitments to reconciliation and the protection of Indigenous rights?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for this very important question. The history of Canada is built on displacement of Indigenous peoples from their lands, which they hold very sacred. This landmark agreement with the Snuneymuxw First Nation involving the return of Camp Nanaimo lands represent a significant step in honoring our commitments to reconciliation. By returning these lands and supporting the nation's vision for development, we are rectifying past injustices and walking the path of reconciliation. I want to thank the tireless advocacy of generations of people who have advocated for this. Bravo. Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Member from Battle River, Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal coalition, Canadians cannot afford to eat. And forcing those who grow the food we need to pay the carbon tax is nonsensical policy. In fact, Vermeer's Dairy, a farm near Camrose, paid $1,700 in the carbon tax alone in December, and they expect that to double when the bill comes for this past January. And the Liberals will once again increase the carbon tax on April 1st. Can someone over there please stand up and admit that it's time to finally lower the cost of food by axing the tax so Canadians can afford to eat?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Being a farmer and being a former dairy farmer, it's hard to imagine what farmers had to deal with. With Hurricane Fiona, farmers woke up, went out to their barn, the barn was destroyed, the cattle were killed. They killed the the cattle themselves.
our seniors. Will these Liberals support the motion to stop the April 1st increase of their costly carbon tax so seniors can afford to eat?
The Honourable Minister for Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And let me emphasize once again that with this carbon plan, 8 out of 10 Canadian households do better than they would otherwise. So the question is, unless they revert to their platform commitment to the Aaron O'Toole Christmas wish book, where government will decide what they'll do with their money, what will they do with the cash that Canadians currently get, that seniors get every month, that seniors know that they can rely on, that they put towards food, that they put towards rent? Where will that money go, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, 40% of Nova Scotians are struggling to pay their electricity bills. Rates have jumped 14% in the last 2 years, and Nova Scotians have to choose between heating and eating. After 8 long years, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. This NDP Liberal government is going to make things worse on April 1st when their next tax hike comes into effect, when they quadruple the carbon tax. Will this costly coalition show some common decency and cancel the tax hike so Nova Scotians can feed themselves, keep a roof over their heads, and keep the heat on?
Hear, hear. Hear. The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The price on pollution is an affordability measure. The vast majority of Canadians receive more money through the carbon price than what they pay. Research from the University of Calgary shows that the Conservatives' plan to cut the carbon price will only benefit the richest 1% and hurt the other 99%. While the Conservatives are fighting to give money to the rich and take money away from those who are most vulnerable, we are building a climate plan that addresses climate change in a manner that addresses...
If I could please ask all members to keep their comments to themselves. I've interrupted the minister. He still has 10 seconds on the clock. The honourable member from Cypress Hills Grasslands, I would ask him please to allow the minister to answer without interruption. The honourable minister has 10 seconds on the clock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, we have the reverse Robin Hoods over here who want to take money out of the pockets of the most vulnerable in Canada and give it to the wealthy in a manner that actually has nothing.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this government, people don't have enough money. Food banks were struggling over the holidays. And now we see the Bloc Québécois fully supporting Liberal policy, and they want to further increase the infamous carbon tax. There's a steep cost for voting for the Bloc Québécois because we know that the Bloc Québécois doesn't understand the reality of our regions. Will the Liberals come back to earth and support our common sense motion to not further increase the tax on April 1st? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, I don't know how many times I've risen in this House to explain to members of the Conservative Party that the federal carbon price does not apply to Quebec. It's that simple. The government of Quebec has its own cap-and-trade system that's been in place for more than a decade, well before the federal program. So if the member has an issue with that in Quebec, he can call the Premier of Quebec, François Legault. I'll be happy to give him his number. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Yesterday, the Minister of Heritage said that the federal government might offer more financial support to CBC, but CBC just announced that it will be laying off 600 people. Several analysts agree that these cuts that Catherine Tate, the CEO, decided on are premature and unfair to the Francophone network. Will the minister demand that Radio-Canada puts an end to this unfortunate decision before giving it access to more funding? The Honourable Minister of Heritage. Mr. Speaker, the CEO of CBC Radio-Canada said very clearly that these cuts had to do with the current financial situation of the public broadcaster. We know that Radio-Canada is very important in Quebec, and that is why we are currently looking at how we can better support CBC Radio-Canada so that it's sustainable in the long term, not just for this fiscal year, but long term. Of course, my goal is to protect jobs within Radio-Canada and within CBC. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Well, I think that that answer shows that we have the same goal to preserve jobs. I think that demanding that the 600 jobs be kept at Radio-Canada would be the least of things before giving the broadcaster more money. And it's also a matter of fairness to private broadcasters who are struggling even more. Bell and TVA have had to lay off many people, hundreds of people. And the Meta news block is also undermining our media. So yes, we need to support Radio-Canada as long as jobs are protected, but will the minister also do her homework and help all of our broadcasters and media, electronic and printed, as well as Radio-Canada? The Honourable Minister. Yes, absolutely, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to work hard to ensure that we support our information media, private, public, community and local media, which play an essential role in our communities throughout Canada. We have been there. We increased the payroll tax credit for newsrooms. We are also looking at the other measures we can take to better support this sector, because we know that it's essential to have quality media, especially to fight against misinformation and propaganda. Mr. Speaker, we continue to believe that that's the right thing to do. We will support our media.
The honourable member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
The past president of the billion-dollar Green Slush Fund shocked committee last night when she revealed that the government was warned of blatant conflicts of interest. The Prime Minister isn't worth the cost of his corrupted billion-dollar Green Slush Fund. The minister claimed that he learned in 2023, but we now know that the ministry was informed in 2019. After 8 years, Canadians can't believe a word from this NDP Liberal government. Right. So why is it that this minister chose to mislead Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear. As soon as we found out about these alleged allegations, the Department of acted quickly. The Minister of Innovation has already accepted the resignation of the CEO and chair. We take these allegations extremely serious, which is why we're doing proper due diligence. Our government is committed to ensuring that organizations which receive federal funding adhere to the highest standards of governments. We are committed to get to the bottom of these allegations. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from South Shore St. Margaret's.
Well, the former CEO of the Liberal Green Slush Fund revealed, one, she warned Liberals that the Prime Minister's hand-picked chair, Annette Vacherian, should not be appointed because of her conflict of interest, and two, Green Slush Fund staff also told the minister of this conflict, but Liberals appointed her anyway. Then Liberal board members went on to vote their own companies more than $20 million of Green Slush Fund money. Wow. Liberals had officials in every meeting, but did nothing about this corruption until it was in the media. Why did take a media story for the Liberals to act on this corruption?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives will say anything to oppose fighting climate change, including saying they want to slash an organization that was voted in by this Parliament 2 decades ago. We're sticking to the facts and due process. We'll continue fighting to get to the bottom of this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job.
The honourable member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
This NDP Liberal government has built the worst imaginable system for government contracting. The Arrive Scam Watchdog report found that the government built a system where companies that charge the least are penalized. Imagine it. They actually built a system in which people are rewarded for charging a high price and punished for charging a lower price. Please, sir, we want to pay even more. No wonder this Prime Minister is so out of touch and isn't worth the cost. After 8 years, the only explanation for this is complete insanity or outright corruption. Which is it?
Yeah, which is it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the question. I also appreciate the report from the Ombudsman yesterday that released all of the issues that we've been talking about in our committee over this very issue. And we've taken the recommendations, we've already started to act upon them, and we've already made some inclusions that the Ombudsman have identified. The member opposite, I know he uses that committee to do his TikTok videos, and he's very good at it, but what's really important is that we ensure that we improve procurement, and we're doing so, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member Dorval Lachine LaSalle.
Mr. Speaker, Telefilm Canada has always played an essential role in creating films and TV shows. Its productions reflect the diversity of our culture, and showcases Canadian talent on the global stage. Over the last few years, there have been significant challenges. Can the Minister of Heritage tell the House about the supports in place to help the sector, promote Canadian content and Francophone content, and to support our content creators? Thank you. The Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Speaker. She's completely right. We are very attached to our culture in Quebec and Canada. We like watching our productions. We are very proud of our stories, of who we are. And that is why yesterday I announced that we will be adding $50 million in funding. I was very pleased to announce this. We know that the Conservatives would cut that, as they did under the Harper government. They like to cut in culture and cut money to our public broadcasters. On this side of the House, we're talking about 140,000 jobs, and it's very important.
Like Eastman.
After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, our troops are being forced to use food banks and live in tents. According to the Halifax emergency manager, young soldiers are coming to work hungry. The Royal Canadian Legion of Nova Scotia said actively serving members are living rough in tents, living in their vehicles, couch surfing, and even entering into relationships to secure housing that have put them at risk of domestic violence. Why is this Liberal Defence Minister allow this to happen under his watch? Why is he failing our troops?
The Honourable Minister of Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the member opposite is once again badly misinformed. And in fact, when this was reported in the press, the Canadian Armed Forces in Nova Scotia canvassed all of the members of the Armed Forces and determined that all of them were properly housed and that the reporting was false.
The Honourable Member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
That's actually not the facts, Mr. Speaker. Nearly 4,500 serving military members are currently awaiting housing, but the Liberals are building less than 20 homes per year for our troops. To add insult to injury, this Liberal minister just cut $1 billion from the defence budget, and a leaked report confirmed that the minister is hiking the rents up for our armed forces members. What? Our military heroes know that these Liberals are just not worth the cost. So why does the Prime Minister always shovel money into the pockets of consultants and Liberal insiders, but cut spending on the backs of our troops?
The Honourable Minister for National Defence.
The member opposite, it's an extraordinary question coming from him in as much as he voted against the pay raise that we recently gave to the Canadian Armed Forces members. But, Mr. Speaker, he should also be aware that Canadian Armed Forces policy caps rents for all members using armed forces military housing at 25% of their gross income. Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to support through making investments in Canadian Armed Forces housing and all of the supports that he keeps voting against.
The Honourable Member from Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, auto thefts are up a striking 34.1% after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government. In my home community of Kamloops, there was recently a car chase that ended up with an RCMP cruiser getting rammed. And get this, Mr. Speaker, imagine our shock when the car was stolen. Mr. Speaker, this NDP Liberal government just isn't worth the cost when it comes to your own property and your own safety. When will this NDP Liberal government start putting Canadians and their property first ahead of fancy vacations and meaningless meetings?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, our government takes the alarming issue of auto theft very seriously.
Absolutely.
That's precisely why, Mr. Speaker, we invested, for example, with the Government of Ontario and local and provincial police forces, increased resources yesterday to ensure that we're doing collaboratively everything that we can do. We're going to add resources to the Border Services Agency. We're going to ensure that the RCMP can continue to partner in the organized crime work that they're doing. Mr. Speaker, we take this seriously, and we're going to bring this alarming level down very quickly.
The Honourable Member from Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, over 400,000 seniors, 77 and over, have successfully applied to the Canadian Dental Care Plan since our government launched the plan in December.
Thanks to the NDP.
These numbers demonstrate strong support for this plan, including seniors in my riding of Kitchener-Conestoga. Conservatives voted against funding toward the dental plan, despite 1 in 4 Canadians reported they could not afford the cost of their dental care. Can the Minister of Health please update the House on our work to provide accessible and affordable dental care for Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Kitchener-Conestoga for his advocacy to make sure that oral health is available for all Canadians. You know, it is now available for those that are 72 and older, and it's going to be rolling out to 9 million Canadians. That's 3.5 million seniors, more than 1 million kids under 18. It's deeply disappointing that the Conservatives are voting against this and looking to get rid of dental care. It's not only essential as a preventative medicine, but for the dignity of seniors who are finally being able to replace their dentures and get the oral health care they need.
The Honourable Member from Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, this government says it respects reproductive rights, but the closure of Clinic 554 means that Fredericton is without a single provider for a safe, trauma-informed abortion care. Despite the Prime Minister campaigning on keeping this clinic open, he has failed to protect the charter right to abortion. And Conservatives, they are actively threatening this right through backdoor legislation. Abortion rights are human rights. Will the minister enforce the Canada Health Act and protect abortion rights in New Brunswick?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, ensuring that women across this country have access to the health care that they need to protect their reproductive and sexual health is absolutely essential. And of course, we did withhold funding from New Brunswick because of the lack of funding for Clinic 554. They made the decision on their own to shut down, but we're deeply concerned with the impact that this is going to have on the ability of women to get access to an abortion. I have already reached out to the government of New Brunswick. We're continuing a conversation because it's essential that those services be kept open to women across the country and certainly in New Brunswick.
The Honourable Member from Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, some UNRWA personnel are said to have participated in the October 7th Hamas terror attack. However, Canada has sent UNRWA $48 million by the time the government got around to suspending its funding. Aside from transparency, timing, and creative accounting, International Development and Global Affairs are now shocked to learn taxpayer dollars have been going to an agency joined at the fanatical hip with Hamas. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of International Development still think UNRWA is a trusted agency, or has he finally recognized that taxpayers don't like funding an agency linked to a listed terror group?
The Honourable Minister for International Development.
Mr. Speaker, these allegations are very disturbing. We've expressed our concerns to the head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini. We're encouraged by the fact that the United Nations has launched an investigation. While we wait for the results of that investigation, we are upping our support, increasing our support to the tune of $40 million to support trusted international partners on the ground that are delivering much-needed life-saving supplies. But, Mr. Speaker, what we will not do is jump to conclusions and smear a UN body like the leader of the official opposition. So if the honourable member wants to do that.
And so comes the end of question period for today. Point of order. I recognize the honourable member from Battle River Crowfoot who is rising on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As it was brought up a number of times in question period in relation to the Parliamentary Budget Office.
I'm going to ask all members please to carry your conversations outside of the House so that I can hear the point of order that the honourable member is trying to raise. For all those who could hear my voice, could you just please say shh? Thank you. The honourable member from Battle River Crowfoot from the top, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm always happy to speak up in this place. Mr. Speaker, since it was brought up a number of times in question period, I'm hoping that if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent to table the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report that says very clearly that more Canadians do not get...
So, I regret the honourable member. I'm hearing many no's from here. I'd encourage all members, when you're seeking unanimous support, to please negotiate it in advance with the different House leaders. I would like Turn to the Honourable Opposition House Leader, the député de Mégantic-les-Rables, pour poser la question du jeudi.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et ça me fait plaisir de souhaiter la bienvenue au ministre d'État à la Chambre des...
There's the government House Leader. Over the next few weeks and months, I have a question for this Honourable House Leader. Has the government decided to put forward interesting subjects for us next week? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Now the new Leader of the Government in the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my Quebecois colleague. And we are going to continue to let the good times roll here in the House of Commons. We always have interesting subjects to debate at all times because we continue to table interesting bills. And tomorrow we'll study Bill C-57.
The 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine will be the subject of debate.